You're listening to Inside iOS Dev. Fuck. That's how it always goes.
You're listening to Inside iOS Dev, a show about real-world iOS development, here with your host, Andrew Rohn.
And Alex Bush.
And today we have a very special guest, Julian Fahrer. Julian, can you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. I'm Julian. I am from Germany and currently in the Silicon Valley to broaden my horizons. And I guess people here generally describe me as a full-stack engineer, but I would personally classify myself more as a DevOps/backend guy.
Awesome, Julian. Thanks for coming. And I guess kind of to give our listeners an idea why we have you, non-iOS dev, here on our show. Essentially, this is a topic that it's been a long time coming. It comes from like my personal experience building. I used to build apps end to end, like the entire thing with iOS side and the backend for it. And what I found that for me, knowing what's going on the backend and holistically the whole system and the big picture helps a lot in building the client side of things. And essentially, like in many ways, the backend structure and backend, let's say, models and stuff like that kind of influence how I implement things on the client side.
That makes a lot of sense.
So yeah, as an example of, let's just say, a feature that you would implement differently from a typical way you would approach it, I guess, if you're just working on the client side, is let's say you have a social networking app and there are posts and users can like them. So usually, you would think that the way you go about it is a like is a counter that you increment, right? And every time a like happens, you increase it by 1, and then send a post request or something to the backend, and then it returns with a success, and you don't do anything. If it returns back with an error of some kind, you kind of flip it back, right, and decrease that counter. But another way of doing it would be to model the backend, right? On the backend, typically likes implemented as a join model between user and the post, right? And it reference one and another, and kind of the amount of records there, the backend computes that and calculates, okay, you have 50 likes for this post, meaning 50 records. Each one of them has their own creation date, when they were updated, and so on, right? So you can kind of have that log and do other things with that. And again, on an iOS side, you typically would not think of doing that. But if you know that is the way the backend builds it and implements it, you can actually model it the same way on the client side, and also have a standalone model object for your like entity, right? And then the advantage it gives you can in the same fashion create it or destroy it on the client side, and have a status on it, for example, right? That like was quote unquote liked and created on the client side, but has not been uploaded to the backend yet for whatever reason. Let's say you have no networking connection, right? And you cannot really send that post request yet. So like things like that, it gives you advantage of treating your typical things that you would not think of treating as models on the client side as such.
It's a very good example, and I would argue that the other side could also benefit from knowing the client side and being aware that an iOS app might not always have an internet connection and can send an update. I guess on the other hand, the likes example is a little bit extreme, and you might end up with, like, let's say 1 million likes on a specific X, whatever it is, product, picture. And if you would store 1 million likes in a database on an iOS device, I think that would probably be a little bit unperformant.
Yeah, that would definitely not work, yes.
Yeah, but same thing here. If a back engineer is aware of that and models data structure in a way that, oh, he's only like giving out counts, but the end device still needs to know, did I as a user like this specific post? Did one of my friends like this post? So you can like model the backend in a way that easily supports the needs of the client rather than just having the pure data in the most efficient way.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly what you said, Julian. It could also backfire, right, on if your kind of amounts of likes and things increase, and then you need to work around that in some other way. I don't know, maybe one of the entities just has a count, right, instead of one, lot, and that way you kind of congest them and combine into one entity. But at the same time, also the other benefit it gives for the client side, I guess, to kind of communicate with the backend in the same quote unquote language, aka RESTful way and manner. Because again, quite often when you structure, at least using Rails, right, when you structure your RESTful API, it follows and closely mapped to the active record model structure. And again, with this likes example, you probably would have a dedicated controller on the Rails side to receive post and delete requests for individual like entities. And that translates into these endpoints that we on iOS side use to communicate that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, and if it's structured by this, using that conventional way instead of increasing or decrementing counts, you get an advantage of like using some kind of library that automates that because it's all based on conventions.
Makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess you could also mix both ways. It's probably like not one thing or the other. It might be a mixture in both, where you like use a data model to communicate with the backend, but still use a counter to actually represent the actual information.
That was a really good story, Alex, about the likes and your experience working end to end. I guess I'm still like a little bit. That helps me clarify why iOS people or iOS developers should kind of have a broader scope of knowledge. But like, can you motivate the point for me more? Like, why should I care about this backend knowledge? I'm in my little iOS island, my nice little app. On my own, like why should I care? Like what do I need to learn? Why do I need to learn from you today, Julian?
Good question. As you said, iOS development is an island, and I guess that reflects to being a specialist. And you want to be a specialist, it makes a lot of sense. Specialists make the most money, but I strongly believe that to become a specialist, you first need to become a generalist. You need to be a generalist to be able to communicate with other departments, be it the backend, be it storage, maybe even being the business side. That broad knowledge helps you to get a better understanding of the actual problems. It allows you to easily solve problems using the right technology, the right tools, or saying no to a problem because it might be better solved on the backend than on the client.
So what would be those things that iOS people would benefit from knowing from the backend perspective?
I think the big factor for me is networking. I started out with networking, and my knowledge around networking helped me throughout my career in IT in many, many ways. The whole networking stack is essentially the base for everything we do these days. It's all about communication. Your iOS app communicates with a backend service. It drags data to another service. It gets ads from another service. It's all like receiving and sending data, and that usually happens over the network.
Right. The iOS app's pretty much useless without internet connection and doing all of this. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And there's a lot of underlying networking things that helps you to understand how to deal with timeouts, what a timeout is, why it occurs, split network issues, how you can tell whether you reliably transmitted data or not. You can make conscious decisions about whether this piece of data is important. Does it need to be in the backend 100% safe and secure, Or is it just some logging information where you don't care, and you don't care about timeouts, so you handle them differently in different locations? Another very important thing, especially for iOS developers, I would say, is understanding HTTP. I would assume, is probably the most used protocol for iOS developers to communicate with backends.
Indeed, yes. That and JSON.
Yep. JSON essentially is just a way to represent data, and you then use HTTP to transport that data represented in JSON to some other system, where this representation of data gets serialized in some form, converted into another format, stored in a database or in a key value store or whatever is happening with that data. And JSON is basically a part of a broader language that allows you to communicate with another system and exchange information. And there's a lot of other rules that people should or should not follow, or like not to follow around that whole stuff. One big keyword is, for example, REST. And understanding what REST is and how it can help you to create a communication with a system using a uniform interface and sticking to certain rules and all the benefits of that can absolutely help you to perform faster and write better code. So, yeah.
It's a lot of that, in my experience, kind of based on conventions. And because of that, that knowledge is then universally applicable in other systems too, right? And like talking to other, like not just Rails developers, backend developers, but maybe Python or whatever, Java, Hibernate, something people.
Absolutely. Or maybe Android is going to take over the world, and all of a sudden you have to do Android from now on, but you still understand the underlying network architecture and the way the systems communicate with each other. All that changes is the programming language.
So yeah, and another thing that is kind of, I guess, universally applicable in the way we all structure code, regardless client side or server side, is separation of concerns, right? Things should not be, roughly speaking, cobbled together and should be separated, and one piece of the code just does one job and another piece does another job. And same separation of concerns, I guess, approach kind of is applicable on the grander scheme, on the higher level between client side and the server side. So what would be an example of kind of concerns that in some scenarios better to be put and logic put on the server side or the client side?
That's a good question. I would say, take for example, you have a system where a person can leave reviews for a restaurant, and then the iOS app requests a list of reviews. And because you're A/B testing something, you want to like change the order of the reviews to first show reviews with a good rating and then reviews with a bad rating, or you want to like show the most viewed reviews on the top and then less viewed reviews on the bottom. And you could have the idea to do that on the client side. Get a list of reviews, you sort them on the client side, you display them. From my perspective, it makes way more sense to make that decision server side and give the client a pre-sorted list. And maybe the client can change the order of the list by passing an argument to the request, saying in which order he would like to have them. And the big advantage here is that if you decide to roll this out for all clients, you can just change it on the back end and it affects everybody. If at some point you decide to make another change and change this, you can make this change without going through the hassle of releasing a whole new app and waiting for users to update. It is live immediately.
And another thing to add there is kind of similar to what we talked about with Like's example, right? There could be a scenario where you have too many reviews for iOS side to download in one request. Then it kind of becomes either the client side does multiple requests or something, or it could be even just too many, right? Reviews. Yeah. And client side just does not make any sense to sort it on the client side. Client side doesn't have all the data to do the accurate sorting, right? And then, the backend should do it because it has all the data.
Totally. From my perspective, the more you can do on the back end, the easier it is. It's kind of different if you have a web app. You can just like release on the fly and change stuff. But for Android, iOS, and other mobile apps where you have to go through a whole process of releasing stuff, I would say put as little logic in there as possible.
Can you give examples of when I should, what things? So I guess mentally I should always, I guess, ask myself as an iOS developer, am I doing too much work on the client side? Should this be offloaded to the server side? And it seems you're of the opinion that I should favor, my first thought should be, let's do the work on the server side. But can you think of examples where it would make more sense to do it client side versus server side?
Sure. And just to be clear, I'm probably heavily biased because I'm a backend engineer and I don't want to take you guys' work away. And there's definitely a lot of scenarios where it makes more sense to do it on the client side. I think a good rule of thumb is if it's about sending data to the server, you might want to pre-process that data. Instead of sending 50 pictures to the backend when only 2 really matter, just send the 2 pictures. It's a very abstract example, but I guess we would need a more a specific app to talk where it would make sense and whatnot. Like, I don't know, like let's like location data. If you only care about latitude, longitude, you only send that. But if the only thing the backend cares about is the street, and your iOS device has multiple ways of getting the current street, maybe manually, maybe getting GPS coordinates and finding the street names. So from longitude, latitude to street name, might make sense to do that on the client and just send the address to the backend.
Or even just not send every location update, only like significant location update, right? Instead of 1,000 changes as you walk, you just send one once in a while.
Yeah, batch them together. That would definitely be client-side logic that should handle that. Another important thing for iOS developers to consider, and a good reason to understand the overall architecture and system. Imagine you implement a new tracking provider and you kind of consolidate all that user tracking and other forms of tracking you had on the you had on the iOS device into a single thing, and you kind of start throwing out stuff you think you don't need anymore. For example, imagine you were going on a product page and you were sending a tracking event to a tracking provider like Mixpanel or Segment about a specific view with metadata, but you also always send a request to the backend that a specific product was viewed. Now you're making this whole new unified system and you only send data to one specific service and you delete that code that was sending data to the backend about a product view. If you would know the backend, you would know that this data was used to count impressions, and impressions was used to change search results, and search results are heavily important for conversion rates. And all of a sudden, because you deleted some code, conversions drop. So understanding the whole architecture of a system and the impact of code you add or delete by just removing some requests is very crucial. And I guess a lot of that is also that the different teams should communicate more, in my opinion. I think it's like, as you said, it's islands, and there's the backend island, and there's the iOS island. And we should all just talk more and know what's going on and why we do stuff. And I also have to admit that we as backend engineers should be a little bit more straightforward and expressive with what we use stuff for and how we use it, and not just reuse stuff that's existing and like not tell anybody and rely on it.
And to add to your point, Julian, I personally firmly believe that developers should be generalists, and everyone should know and work on the client side and the backend side regardless. It's just code. But I know a lot of people don't agree. I go to extremes in that regard.
That's fair, I guess. I would say I agree to a certain extent, and think as mentioned, iOS developers should definitely learn some backend stuff and some networking stuff. And I also think that backend developers should learn some iOS stuff, even if it's just about understanding that there's limited resources in iOS device, and sending big bulk of data that is not needed on the client is maybe a bad idea, not just bandwidth wise, but also just performance wise for the app. So yeah, I do support that there's a more, I guess, cross-team learning, cross-team communication, cross-team X, whatever it is.
Yeah, with Julian, we just want you to build some iOS app, use Objective-C, make it work.
Wow, that sounds really exciting.
Okay, guys, I feel like this has been a good episode so far. I guess let's close out here in the last 30 seconds or a minute with key takeaways. Julian, what are some key takeaways you think people can learn today?
I think my big key takeaway is, again, to become a specialist, you first need to become a generalist. Try to learn as much as possible to a certain extent, and then try to go really deep on one topic, and in your case, probably iOS.
Maybe another key takeaway that I just thought of right now is better communication. We can always have better communication between backend and the client side.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think that will help you to understand the holistic system and make better overall decisions.
Right. Okay, guys, that's everything. Thank you very much for listening. Julian, is there anything you wanted to plug or tell our listeners about?
A little self-promotion, of course.
Yep.
If you want to learn more about backend stuff, general networking, and how it all ties together, check out codetails.io.
Codetails.io. Go do it now, guys. This was just a small sample. This guy has so much knowledge in that head of his. Super smart. Okay, guys, thanks for listening. Bye.